We have 7,500 miles of streets and alleys that we manage, 5,000 traffic signals, 37,000 parking meters, and we also run a transit service. And LADOT is a founding member of the Open Mobility Foundation.
Hi, this is Anand Bhatia from TFIR, and we are here in Washington, D.C. And today we have a representative from OMF, Open Mobility Foundation, Celita Reynolds. First of all, tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. So I run the Department of Transportation for the city of Los Angeles. It's a big job. It's a huge operational department. We have 7,500 miles of streets and alleys that we manage, 5,000 traffic signals, 37,000 parking meters, and we also run a transit service. And LADOT is a founding member of the Open Mobility Foundation.
Now, let's talk about the foundation itself. Why was the foundation created? What problem that you saw that you wanted to solve with it?
So about a year or so ago, the city of Los Angeles published on our LA GitHub a set of mobility data specifications. And we wanted to do that intentionally in open, and we wanted to do it on GitHub because we were confronting a big challenge in that scooters and dockless bikes, electric bikes, were showing up in our city. And we were really excited about it. We wanted to welcome them into LA because everybody knows LA for its traffic, and people need choices for how to get around. But in order to make sure that we were balancing the people who wanted to use the scooters with the people who were on the sidewalks and living in the neighborhoods, and to keep those things in balance, we needed information in order to regulate these companies. And so we published the mobility data specifications specifically to carry out our role as the regulator in the space. And almost overnight, about a dozen cities started using LA's mobility data specifications to regulate their own scooters and dockless bike programs in their cities. And now, about a year later, there are about 80 cities around the world that currently have an active MDS feed. And while it's great that we built a tool that solves a real problem, that allows cities to welcome in innovative new ways to get around, and at the same time make sure that they're holding companies accountable for good behavior, we knew that LA couldn't continue to be the sole sort of owner. If we wanted this to grow and flourish over time and eventually help cities manage all kinds of mobility problems, then the right thing to do was to create an open source foundation. So we took a lot of time and thought about it very carefully, because usually what you see in open is that industry governs a code. So the companies that may be able to build products on top of the code itself, a lot of times are the ones who are governing the code base. This is a little different. This is cities governing the code base. So this is about the market actually governing the growth of code. And in order to make sure it still solves real problems and is really useful, we wanted to make sure that there was a sort of a forum to build consensus around that. And so we created what we think is one of the first of its kind, sort of a city-led open source foundation around mobility.
Let's talk about the scope of because you mentioned scooters and all. Is it just limited to these kind of platforms, or because as we are embracing a lot of emerging technologies, people will be using different means?
Yes.
So what is the scope of the foundation? How far you will go?
Well, one of the reasons why we sort of arrived at this place is that, the first big sort of disruption in mobility was the arrival of the transportation network companies, ride-hail companies like Uber and Lyft, back in 2011 and 2012. And when that happened, we realized that we were witnessing a sort of a birth of a new business model. And the business model is being able to move goods and people using the phone that's in the palm of your hand, just at the click of a button using an app. It's scooters. Well, actually, a year ago, it was dockless bikes. Now, most of those companies have either turned into scooter companies or they've gone out of business. And we know that there'll be a new innovation that comes after that and comes after that and comes after that. So when we built MDS, we built it really originally, what we were thinking about was how we were going to manage drones and autonomous vehicles. So we wanted to build something that could sort of sustain itself over multiple, it doesn't matter what the form factor is, the business model is here to stay. And so we wanted to build something that could be sustainable across all of those different things, whatever comes next. And what I think is that when we are able to give a clear set of ground rules, we can actually invite more innovation in cities. So, whatever your new idea is, if it's, delivering burritos by robot, or it's jetpacks, we're excited to see those innovations in LA, but we want everybody to play by the same set of rules.
So it's more or less like building an infrastructure for the companies.
Yes.
They can bring, it doesn't really matter what future model will be, because, as you mentioned, autonomous vehicle, like Elon Musk was talking about, I think, instead of selling cars to people, like robo-taxis.
That's
where
right.
You'll just be renting the cars you want to actually own, but you need some platform where you can move the cars around.
Yeah, and there's a lot of excitement and
Yeah.
imagination and big ideas, and we just want to make sure that with all of that, there's not a lot of chaos, and that we run the risk of things showing up in cities and there being a backlash because it's too chaotic or because it's not safe. And then we might have a chilling effect on innovation. So we think that this is a tool that allows us to invite innovation in. And if you're a business, it also allows you to build to one spec, right? A lot of the startups don't have, extended engineering teams that can write, 50 different APIs for different cities. And so in this way, they can build once. And then as long as they're complying with it, they can come into and work with multiple cities.
So when you're building this platform, what are the core components that are part of it, which will help, in not only being able to access the data, but also create something which is centralized as well as decentralized when it comes to data?
Yeah, and I think that's the big conversation is, it absolutely is around data ownership and related to that, privacy. This data that MDS extracts is not about the human that's on the scooter. I don't have a credit card information. I don't have the join key that tells me that, that Swapnil took, 50 different trips on 50 different Bird scooters. I just know that a trip happened. So I'm really just interested in the vehicle itself. And I'm only interested in collecting the bare minimum that I need in order to carry out the regulations that the city council is asking me to perform. And that's actually a really small data set. It's much smaller than the amount of robust data that a company might have about you if you're the one on the scooter, or if you're the one that takes the scooter home and charges it at night and gets paid to do that. I think that in LA's position is that data that gets generated on the public realm by for-profit companies that are providing a service to people, it belongs to the public. And so what our perspective is that we want to take as little as we need, we want to use it, and then we want to not hold it for any longer than we have to. But I think this is such a new space that we also are treating that data with an extraordinary amount of caution. One thing that I don't know that people really think about is all of the data that a city already has in order to deliver its services. So if you come to Los Angeles, we hope you have a great time. We hope you don't get a parking ticket, but you might. And if you do, LADOT has a lot of information about you. We have your vehicle identification number and your credit card information in order to sort of carry out that service that we provide in the city. This information that we're getting is much smaller than that, but we're treating it with the same amount of care. We designate it confidential. It's not exposed to law enforcement. Nobody can access it without a warrant because we consider ourselves stewards of the public good. And so we're treating that data as part of the public good.
What kind of data is that?
So there's maybe 4 or 5 different pieces of data that we get. One is just a vehicle identification number, because one of the things that we do is count how many scooters are in LA at any given time. And I need to know that because companies actually can deploy more or fewer scooters based on how well they're being used. So I also need to know how many trips are occurring. And actually just last week on Friday, there were over 52,000 trips on scooters and bikes in LA, just the city, in a single day. The other thing I need to know is where the fleet is at any given time. And that's really for 2 reasons. One, part of the program that the city designed had a very intentional focus on equity. And what that means is we know that these companies want to go to neighborhoods like Venice. We know they want to go to Hollywood and downtown and the Arts District and Koreatown, and that's great. But we want to make sure that if you live in the San Fernando Valley, or if you live in Boyle Heights, or if you live in South LA, which might not be as wealthy of a community, that you have access to these choices too. So we hold companies accountable for making sure that they're serving all of the communities. And then the other reason is that we actually have what are called geofences. There are certain places in the city that the scooters are not allowed. One of those is the Venice canals. And so we need to know how many companies are violating that geofence on a day-to-day basis so that we can work with them to try and get them back into compliance. And sometimes that geofence can change day to day, right? So LA has one of the largest open streets events in the world called Ciclavia. Thousands of people come out, we close the streets to cars, we open them to bikes and to people, and scooters are not allowed to be on Ciclavia routes. And so on the Ciclavia day, we create another geofence to sort of tell companies, here's where you need to be watchful on today, because we don't want you to violate our rules.
So how do you maintain that the governance will remain open, as you want it to be?
Yeah. So the board of directors, which holds a lot of power, is comprised just of public entities. And we actually have a county on there, as well as a bunch of cities. And we actually have an international city. Bogota, Colombia is also a founding member. So that's the board. And the board has the final say in the architectural roadmap. And that's probably one of the single most powerful sort of tools that the board has. However, to your point, what we're trying to do here is build an ecosystem. And it won't work if it's just cities that get to influence and sort of guide the growth of the code. So there's a technology council that has some city members and some commercial members. Microsoft is on the technology council. Two of the scooter companies, Bird and Spin, are on the council. And then actually a car share company called Blue Systems and a data analytics and visualization company called Stay. Those are all sort of founding members of the Technology Council. And the idea is that the Technology Council actually collaborates with the other members to create the architectural roadmap, and then the board approves it. And then there's a third group, the Advisory Council. This is nonprofits and foundations. We have seed funding from the Rockefeller Foundation. And then we also have groups like ITS America, Transportation for America, and a lot of other sort of nonprofits that are part of that advisory council. They're the panel of experts, and they're the ones that we're going to call on when we start getting into thornier sort of problems, to have that third-party validator there to say, look, here's a great case study from somewhere else. We have the International Transit Association there. So we want to continue to grow that ecosystem in balance: public, private, nonprofit, academic. And part of the reason for that is that the challenges that we face in transportation are incredibly steep. We're trying to, turn back the clock on climate change. We're trying to save people's lives. We're trying to make sure people have access to opportunity. And if public and private and nonprofit stay in our silos, we will never solve those problems. No one sector is going to solve that all by themselves. But I looked around and I didn't see a lot of forums for this kind of true collaboration, not just about, policies or white papers, but actually about the growth of a very specific tool done transparently out in the open.
And you mentioned, some thorny topics as well there. What was the biggest challenge that the foundation faced? Was it technology, or was it dealing with people?
What do you mean? Dealing with people is super easy. No, I think that
you have to change mindset.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, that's really the bottom line, is that part of this is that cities are now expressing our ability to manage infrastructure in a digital realm. For a city like Los Angeles to publish APIs on an open source platform and start to use them in a very real way, meant that we were acting more like a product company and a little bit less like, sort of an old school bureaucracy. And I think that asserting that ability to grow out that digital infrastructure caught some companies by surprise. I think they didn't believe us when we said this is what we were setting out to do. And I think that some of that, changing minds and hearts and minds about how to do business with cities and how to be in cities, is probably one of the biggest challenges that we face.
Right. Uh, what is the overall mission, or goal? Like, is there a point you'll say, hey, our job is done, we have achieved, or it's always an ongoing process,
Right. No, I will be out of a job if we ever really solve everything. But
Unless the robots take over, then we are
yes, right. That's for another video, I think, future of work. But I do. Here's what I know. I mean, I've been in transportation for over 20 years now. I've worked in the public sector, the private sector, and cities all around the country. And transportation has never stopped changing. The space has never stopped growing. There's always been a new challenge. There's always been some new thing that we have to sort of put our heads together and work on and solve in mobility. And I don't expect that to change anytime soon. And so the other nice thing about an open source foundation is that it can be sustainable over a long period of time. The structure is there. If the ecosystem works the way that we're hoping it would work, then it doesn't matter who's sitting in my seat at LADOT, if it's now or if it's during the 28 games in Los Angeles, or if it's way out past that in 2050 when who knows what kind of transportation challenges we'll be dealing with. This sets up something that can stand the test of time over a long period of time and continue to confront and solve whatever challenges come our way if we can get the forum right. So to your question, when do I think we're done? We're never done, but I think my goal, and especially for the first year, is to really make something that everybody agrees functions as a really a viable place for us to come together, no matter what seat you sit in.
So when would be something like, okay, OMF version 1.0? When can we expect that?
Well, actually, the City of LA is going to contribute all of the code that we already built into the OMF. So if you are a city who has Los Angeles GitHub linked in your regulations, eventually you're going to need to link to the OMF GitHub. And that release will happen as soon as we make that contribution. So the first board meeting is towards the end of the month, and that's when I expect we'll start sort of heading down that path of creating a cadence around those releases. But we're not starting from scratch, and we actually have a really great sort of foundation to build on.
Why did you choose open source for this? You can just work with a proprietary company and get a proprietary code. What is the benefit that you see in open source?
So I would say 2 or 3 things. The first is when you have a number of different eyes and you have, in the best examples, teams of rivals even, that are all looking at the same code and working on trying to grow it, you get better code. If you are all sort of, if you're working kind of in a bubble or inside a single company, you don't get that same kind of benefit of having, a huge variety of people with skill sets and ideas all coming together to make the code stronger. I think that's one of the most powerful arguments for open source, is that it just delivers the best results. Mm-hmm. But the second part is, you're absolutely right. There are private companies right now that are building black box solutions that they call, operating systems or mobility marketplaces, all kinds of sort of branding around it. And that is not a good outcome for cities. Number one, because it means that if you are a city that doesn't have a lot of resources, you're just left behind. An open source tool is available for anybody to use. And the other problem is that when we get in as cities, and we have a lot of examples of this and lessons learned in LA, when we get in a long-term dependency with a single company, then our fortunes are tied to that company's fortunes. If they get acquired, if they go bankrupt. For example, the system that we used to use to manage taxis in LA doesn't exist anymore. And that means that now we're sort of left high and dry, and we have to start all over again and go out into the marketplace and try and invest in something new. So it's much, much better if you can have companies competing on the products that live on top of the code and not on owning the code itself.
Right, so you're not logged into a vendor, and then anybody can come over and take over because the code
That's
is
right.
out there. And I think it also allows, I think, different cities to send their own patches.
Yes.
You're not dependent on one company, because your requirement may be different from some other cities' open source code, so you can tweak it the way you want.
That's right.
If either open source developer or city, they want to get involved with the project, what they can do?
So they can go to openmobilityfoundation.org and they can send us a note and become part of the foundation. It's free for cities to join. Anybody who manages the public realm can be a part of the OMF. It's also a 501c6, so any private company that wants to join is welcome and can join as well. The advisory council is another sort of avenue for nonprofits and universities to be part of OMF. So, in order to make sure that we are staying true to kind of the open source, the way that you run an open source community, we're open.
Perfect. Any closing thoughts before we wrap up this interview?
Sure. So one of the things that we talk about a lot around MDS and data specifically is the principles that we used when we designed the mobility data specs to begin with. First and foremost, doing something as an open source project, doing it transparently, doing it out in the open, and inviting in everybody to help us make it better was really the one of the initial thoughts that we had. Another is privacy. Privacy is in the DNA of MDS. We don't collect any more than we need. We only keep it for as long as we need it, and we protect it with a really high level of care. We have privacy principles that we published, that we put out for public comment in order to continue to work on that and make it better and better and better. That's going to be a day one job of OMF around privacy, and it'll probably be a forever job. The third is to avoid a patchwork of regulations. So if you make an autonomous vehicle, you want to know that if you're in Minneapolis or if you're in Los Angeles, the traffic signal looks the same. And if it's a digital version of that traffic signal, that also needs to look the same. So we needed to sort of have that in order to overcome something that I hear a lot from private companies, which is, the federal government ought to just intervene because we need to avoid this patchwork of regulations. It needed to be sustainable over multiple business models because we can't predict what will come next. I saw an article about pogo sticks in San Francisco that we can talk about some other time, but there's no sort of predicting nobody could have, if we were having this conversation a year ago, we wouldn't have been talking about scooters. The other piece is about avoiding monopolies. So to the conversation we just had about avoiding kind of black box and proprietary solutions so that we have something that everybody can use. And the last is just flexibility. So if you are, to your point earlier, a smaller city and you don't need to use the entire code, you can take the pieces that work for you. And that modularity is just really, really important for cities.
Awesome. Thanks so much for talking to me today, and I actually look forward to catching up with you again and to see the follow-up on where the foundation is moving.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.